thank you all for coming today. I feel really honored that all of you came to be a part of my defense, so thank you so much. So today I'm presenting Successful African American Women in Science and Narrative Inquiry. So the reason that I decided to do this research was because I read an article, actually in Dr. Tan's class. It was an interview with Evelyn Hammonds. Evelyn Hammonds was in the physics program at Spelman College. And because she was one of the few women in the program, she took classes at Morehouse, all male. And then when she moved on, she went to Georgia Tech and took classes there as well. And after that, she graduated successfully and then went to MIT to start the master's and PhD program there. But she didn't finish. After 2 years, she decided to leave, and she decided to leave because she just couldn't take it anymore. It was just too much, having to figure out when people made comments, was it racism or sexism? Did they just not like me because of something personal? She just got tired. And so what she said was, when asked by the interviewer, she asked, well, do you think it was one or the other? And she said, they're not separate because they're not separate in me. I am always black and always female. And so she got to the point where she was just tired of asking herself those questions, and so she did leave. And so for me, that kind of sparked an interest in, well, why would, if someone's so talented, she's at the top of her class, someone's so talented and so interested in science, why would she have to leave? Why is it like that? So then I thought about, what about the ones that have been able to make it, the successful African American women in science, that have been able to persist despite the system and make it? And so that's what I wanted to look at. I wanted to ask that question, what are your experiences? What have they been like? So that we could maybe help more women in the future to make it through. And so if we look at the statistics, the bar that I want you to focus on is the yellow one. So, no, I'm sorry, the green. Looking at the green one, it's 6.01% if you look at the population. But as far as women that have been able to receive their PhD, it's about 2.61%. We would like to see that a little bit more even if we're really truly preparing women to be able to make it into science successfully. And so for my literature review, just to tell you a little bit about what I looked at women in science, and what we're finding is that more women are earning PhDs in some areas, but they're not staying. And so a little bit of what the research that I did looked at that. It's an unwelcoming environment. They're not staying because it's not very welcoming. When they get there, they don't feel like they're welcome, so they're leaving. And then when we look at African American in science specifically, some of the things that impact us positively would be instructional practicing, mentoring, and participation, being able to actively participate. And some of the things that negatively impact would be identity conflict, the conflict between being African American but also being a scientist, because we really don't see ourselves there. So that's a conflict that sometimes happens. Deterring messages, isolation is a huge one. Marginalization and racialization. Racialization is being in an environment where you feel like you're representing the entire race. You walk into a room and you don't see anyone like you, and you just feel this burning of feeling like you're representing everyone there. So did anybody notice the makeup of the room when you came in here? Did you look around at the racial, but it's okay to talk. Did anybody pay attention to that?
I did.
Okay. So when these women get into science environments, they pay attention to that. And when they see that they're the only one, the only female, the only African American, that creates a burden for them, and that's racialization. So these were my research questions. So my big overarching questions, I wanted to understand experience. And so I asked, what are the life stories of successful African American women in science? And my sub-questions were, how do successful African American women in science define themselves? And I'll call that self-definition. I'll talk about where that term came from. What have been the facilitators and barriers encountered by successful African American women? And what have been their systems of support? So the questions that I asked, and the way I conducted my research, was to get at those questions and to find that out. And so my theoretical positions in academic research, we have theoretical positions that ground our research, the lens that we look at. It's what we choose to pay attention to. You could research anything. If we were to research the people in the room, or we could research clothing, hairstyles. There's so many different things that we could research. But when we're looking at a particular question, we want to focus in on something. It's the lens that I use in order to focus my research. So I use Black feminist thought and critical race theory. I use both of those because Black feminist thought really focuses on the African American women and the experiences and the history there. One of the most important things is self-definition. That's why I pulled out that term when I was doing my research and asking my questions, is how do we define ourselves? There's a very rich history in the way African American women have been able to persist because of the way that we define ourselves. And then when it comes to critical race theory, one of the important factors is that racism is endemic. That's one of the tenets of critical race theory. Endemic meaning it's here in American history, it always has been, and unfortunately, the people who subscribe to this idea believe that it always will be. So that's one of the really important factors. And then also counter-narrative. There's an overall narrative that we hear. We hear stories, but very often we don't hear the stories of African American people or people who are not so prevalent in society. So what critical race theory calls for us to do is to let those counter-narratives be heard. And also intersectionality. So intersectionality is the way that they intersect. So Evelyn Hammond says, I am black, and I am woman, and I always will be. I am in every situation that I go into, I am that. And so that's the intersectionality. You can't separate one from the other. So these were my theoretical positions. All right, so very important. What I chose to do as far as my study was narrative inquiry. And so when you're doing a narrative inquiry, studying stories and experiences, you have to also study and think about who you are in that research. So I am just a little bit of all of these pictures up here. I was raised in a family that with a very strong educational and background with knowing African American history and learning about it since we were born. We knew everybody in African American history from the time we were brought up. So I had a very strong sense of who I was. And so I just wanted to put this up there, just that kind of lets you understand who I am and why this story was important to me, is that I really am committed to understanding the experience of African Americans. So what is narrative inquiry? I'm not going to read this. I'm just going to pretty much explain that when we're thinking about life and experiences, the way that we share our experiences with others is by telling stories. When you get to know somebody, you might tell them a story about how you grew up, or where you came from, or a funny story about your family. So that's how we get to know each other and understand it. So we live and then we tell stories. When you're telling that story, you actually have to kind of go back and relive that moment. So if it's a happy moment, you might laugh and smile when you're thinking about it. If it's a sad moment, it might actually bring you to tears again. But in that reliving, we're also retelling, so they go hand in hand. So when we're talking about narrative inquiry and studying experience, we're talking about living, telling, reliving, and then retelling the stories of experience. So my participants were 5 African American women, and I chose to look at women kind of across the trajectory of academia. So I had a woman that was a postdoctoral candidate, a doctoral candidate, a postdoctoral scholar, an assistant professor, associate professor, and a full professor. So these are the participants. Dr. Grace Williams is a full professor. She currently works at Frederick Douglass University. All of these are pseudonyms for both the participants and the universities. Frederick Douglass University is at HBCU. Dr. Cynthia Naima Anderson also works at Frederick Douglass University. She's been there since 2006, and she is an associate professor. Dr. Skylar Dawson Bennett is an assistant professor at Harriet Tubman University, also an HBCU. Samantha Johnson just finished her postdoc this year and started this year at University of Freeman just this past fall, and that is a predominantly white institution, or a PWI. And Delia Rhodes is a doctoral candidate. She's still at North State, but actually working in the South, and she has not finished yet, so her degree is pending. And so this is how I did my data. Really quickly, I did 2 interviews. Between the interviews, I listened to what the participants were saying so that I could better ask questions in the next interview. So I did request their CVs just to take a look at their history and what they had been doing. The first interview, I asked lots of questions about their past, how they came into science. Like I said, I listened to the first interview between the 2, and then I was able to go back and finish listening again. I listened to them several times, and then I analyzed my data. So in the analyzing of data, you basically complete interim text, that's your interviews. You then start building your stories and making storylines, and then the final phase is just pulling it all together, which is probably the hardest part. So how did it all come together? So when I looked across, because it did take a little bit of time, it didn't happen easily. It took a lot of time for me to look across all the stories of the participants to see what they were saying. So in the first part, what I chose to tell was stories about curiosity. And stories about curiosity is basically these women were all connected to science at very young ages. For whatever reason, they were just interested in science, interested in being outside. They enjoyed making mud pies and figuring out if I add different chemicals to the mud pies, would it make it better? One of the participants, Samantha, talked about how she had the best mud pies on the playground because she used soap in hers, so she figured out she could make them smoother. Another one Naima talked about, for her, she felt like science was just so natural. Her mother was actually a science teacher, so going outside and looking through the telescope was something she was able to do growing up, and that all connected her to science. When I talk about stories about teachers in school, that's about how all of the women really had experiences and had at least one teacher that was influential in their life. And I thought that was really interesting. There was at least one science teacher who really connected them to science. They could recall their names, and they remember the things that they did. And to me, that kind of connected with me as a science teacher because it meant that what we do in the classroom was really important. So for Skylar, I called it the Mice and Mazes when I was telling her story because she did a science fair project where she actually built a maze. She had a male and female mouse run the maze, and then she was able to see which one was smarter, she said. For Naima, she said science to her was like drinking water. It's very natural, very just natural when she was at home. She just enjoyed doing it with her family. She was voted most likely to be a scientist at school. She had a teacher who did an experiment with Slinkies, and those are things that she never forgot, so it always connected her to science. For Samantha, she and I laughed about this one when she talked about little Eli. Little Eli was the fetal pig that she dissected in school. And so if you're a science major, you dissected a pig, you understand the connection. If you're not, you're like, that's a little weird. But we talked about how she had little Eli, and that really did it for her. She was like, it was all about the pig. That really connected her to science. For Delia, it was her chemistry class. She said that class kicked her butt left and right. She had never been really challenged until she got to chemistry. That class was very challenging, and she actually liked it. She enjoyed it. She enjoyed the challenge. So when she got to college, she majored in chemistry because of that connection. And Dr. Grace Williams, who had come into school, in middle school she was integrated, so that's why I called it being bus. I even drove the bus, because when she was 16, she did drive the bus. She was in an integrated school, and they were in a new neighborhood, but for her, it was a little different in her community. She'd experienced the same kind of racism and everything. They were pretty much equal as far as the black students and white students in the class, and the black students excelled. They had really strong teachers that were able to have them excel. All the women talked about being introduced to research. When they went to college, they all went to HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, and they were all connected to research in some particular way by doing research, and that really made the connection for them and really committed them then to science. So that was scientific beginnings.